"Get that man out of my courtroom." The words landed like a gavel strike, and every head in the gallery turned. Not toward the lawyers at their polished tables, not toward the junior associates in their pressed suits. Toward the back row, where a man in a gray parka, the kind you buy at a surplus store on Dundas Street, sat perfectly still with a cardboard folder on his lap. The man didn't flinch. His name was Kwesi Darko. He was 34 years old, and he had just walked 40 minutes in a February sleet storm across downtown Toronto because the subway delay made him 7 minutes late to the pre-hearing lobby. He had not eaten since the night before. He had a hole in the left sole of his boot that let in water with every third step. And he had in that cardboard folder the thing that was going to end Meridian Capital's 30-year run of fraud. Nobody in the room knew that yet. What they saw was what they always saw when Kwesi walked into a room. A big man, broad through the shoulders, dark-skinned, shaved head, a jaw that looked carved rather than grown. He wore no tie because he owned no tie that matched. His parka had a small tear near the left pocket that he had mended himself with electrical tape, badly. He was not the kind of man that rooms like this were built for, and rooms like this had a way of making sure you knew it. The hearing room on the 31st floor of the Bay Street Tower had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the lake. On a clear day, you could see Mississauga. Today was not a clear day. Sleet hammered the glass in long gray curtains, and the light inside was that flat, corporate white that makes everyone look vaguely unwell, except for Harlan Voss. Harlan Voss looked exactly as healthy as a man who had never worried about money in his life looked. He was 61, silver-haired, with the kind of tan you only get in February if you've been somewhere that isn't Canada. He sat at the far end of the defendant's table in a suit that cost more than Kwesi's monthly rent. And he watched Kwesi cross the room with an expression that was not quite contempt. It was something quieter than contempt, more like the look a man gives a stray cat that has wandered onto his porch. Mild irritation, brief. Meridian Capital had been under investigation for securities fraud for 18 months. 3 teams of forensic accountants from 2 different firms had been through the books. Meridian's lawyers, 7 of them, arranged along the table like a defensive line, had produced 11,000 pages of documentation. The Ontario Securities Commission had assigned its 2 most senior investigators to the file. None of them had found what Kwesi had found. Kwesi was not an OSC investigator. He was not a forensic accountant. He held a degree in applied mathematics from the University of Ghana, obtained 16 years ago, which no Canadian licensing body had ever fully recognized. He worked, at the time of this hearing, as a data entry supervisor at a mid-sized logistics company in Etobicoke, where he made $53,000 a year and was considered very good at his job, which was considered by his employer to be a simple job. He had found the discrepancy by accident, or not entirely by accident. He had been doing contract reconciliation work on the side. The kind of thing that paid $200 here, $300 there, checking ledgers for small businesses that couldn't afford proper accountants. When a former colleague had passed him a fragment of Meridian's public disclosure filings, "Just to look at," the colleague said, "just to see if anything looked strange." Something had looked strange. What Kwesi found over the following 9 months, working at his kitchen table after his daughter went to sleep, was not a simple error. It was a pattern, a very careful, very elegant pattern of recursive misrepresentation that had been threaded through Meridian's derivative holdings since 1997. It had been constructed by someone who understood mathematics at a level that the standard audit protocols were not designed to detect. It was, in its way, a beautiful piece of work, and it had moved over 3 decades, approximately $240 million from pension funds, teachers, nurses, transit workers, into Meridian's private accounts. Kwesi had mapped all of it, in his kitchen, on graph paper and a 6-year-old laptop, in the hours between 10 at night and 2 in the morning, while the sleet hit his window and his daughter slept in the next room. He had brought it to the OSC 8 months ago. They had thanked him politely and told him they would be in touch. They were not in touch. He had tried again, then a third time. Then he wrote a 12-page summary and couriered it to the lead investigator's office. He received an automated acknowledgement. That was when he found out, through a contact at the commission, that his submission had been filed under unsolicited third-party correspondence and had not been read by anyone with decision-making authority. The reasoning, as it was explained to him secondhand, was that an unqualified civilian, not a licensed accountant, not a financial analyst, not a registered investigator, submitting analysis of this complexity was more likely to be confused than correct. He was not a professional. Therefore, his work was not professional work, so he came to the hearing himself. The man who had told him to get out was Meridian's lead counsel, a lawyer named Sterling Pruitt, who had argued before the Supreme Court of Canada twice and won both times. Sterling Pruitt was not a man given to patience. He was 63 years old and had spent 4 decades making sure that rooms like this one remained orderly and correctly populated. "This is a closed pre-hearing session," Pruitt said, not raising his voice because he never needed to raise his voice. "Members of the public are not permitted. Security." The bailiff by the door took a step forward. Kwesi did not stand up. He opened the cardboard folder on his lap and removed a single sheet of paper, which he held up between 2 fingers. "I have a Section 11 complaint submission sent under the Securities Act," he said. "Filed this morning. Case reference 2024 OSE 2847. I'm the complainant." A very brief silence. Sterling Pruitt looked at the OSC's lead counsel, a woman named Andrea Chow, who looked at her assistant, who was already on his phone. 20 seconds passed. The sleet kept hitting the window. The assistant leaned over and said something quietly to Andrea Chow. Andrea Chow said, "He's correct, he has standing." Pruitt looked at Kwesi for a long moment. "Fine," he said. "Sit there and be quiet." Kwesi sat there. He was not quiet in the sense that he had pages to distribute, but he did it without speaking, which seemed to satisfy the room's interpretation of quiet. What happened over the next 3 hours was not dramatic, in the way that courtroom dramas on television are dramatic. There were no speeches. No one broke down. The fluorescent light continued its flat corporate hum. What happened was mathematics. Kwesi had been given through the complaint process 15 minutes to present. He used 14 of them. He did not use slides or a screen. He used 3 printed charts, a reference key, and a sequential walkthrough of the pattern he had identified. The specific mechanism by which Meridian's reporting structure had been constructed to route misclassified derivatives through a series of holding relationships that, individually, fell below audit thresholds, but collectively described something unmistakable. He had been in enough rooms to know he had about 90 seconds before the people in them stopped listening and started waiting for him to finish. He had structured his presentation to front-load the 2 findings that were specific enough to verify immediately. 2 transactions, 2 dates, 2 amounts, cross-reference to Meridian's own public filings. If those were wrong, nothing else mattered. They were not wrong. You could see the moment it shifted. It wasn't in Harlan Voss. Voss was too controlled for that. It was in the junior associates. The ones who had actually read the filings. The ones who were young enough that their faces still moved when they processed information they hadn't anticipated. 2 of them went pale. Sterling Pruitt stopped looking at Kwesi like he was a stray cat on a porch. He didn't look at him with respect, exactly. He looked at him with something more guarded. The look of a man who has just discovered that the stray cat has been watching the house. Andrea Chow asked to recess. There is a photograph, somewhere in a file the OSC holds, of the document Kwesi brought that day. The original. The one in the cardboard folder. It is printed on paper that has been folded and unfolded enough times that the creases have gone soft. In the margin of page 7, someone, Kwesi, has written a note to himself in pencil. The note says, "Check the 1998 bridge transactions." Below that, in smaller letters, "You are right. Keep going." He had written that note to himself, sometime around midnight on a Tuesday 8 months earlier, at his kitchen table, when the math had started to feel too large and too lonely to carry alone. His daughter had come out of her room that night, not quite asleep, and asked what he was doing. He told her he was checking some numbers. She asked if the numbers were behaving. He told her they were starting to. She went back to bed. The formal outcome came 4 months later. Meridian Capital's operating license was revoked. Harlan Voss and 2 senior partners faced charges under the Securities Act. The pension funds, the teachers, the nurses, the transit workers, began a recovery process that would take years, but that, for the first time, had a clear evidentiary foundation. The OSC's official press release acknowledged the role of a third-party mathematical analysis in identifying the core pattern of misrepresentation. It did not name Kwesi Darko. He read the press release on his phone on his lunch break, standing in the parking lot of the logistics company in Etobicoke, because the break room had no good cell signal. It was April by then. The sleet was gone. There was a thin, tentative sun over the highway overpass. He read it twice. Then he put his phone in his pocket and went back to work. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. Kwesi Darko knew it well. It was the exhaustion of being consistently correct in rooms that were consistently not interested in your correctness, of doing the work and watching the credit redistribute itself toward the people who had, until the last possible moment, been invested in believing the work could not be done. He had been in Canada for 11 years. He had arrived with a mathematics degree that the professional bodies told him was equivalent to approximately 2/3 of a Canadian credential. He had spent 14 months in requalification courses, then discovered that the licensing fees for full accreditation were beyond what he could manage, while also paying rent and raising a child alone. He had taken the data entry job as a temporary measure. It was 11 years temporary. He was good at his job. He had been promoted twice. His manager, a man named Bruce, who wore the same 2 fleeces in rotation, and genuinely believed that Kwesi was the best data entry supervisor the company had ever had once told him during a performance review, "I don't know what we'd do without you, Kwesi. You just have a knack for this stuff." Kwesi had thanked him. He had not said, "I hold a degree in applied mathematics, and I once spent 9 months reconstructing a 30-year fraud scheme at my kitchen table, and it resulted in the largest securities enforcement action in Ontario in a decade." That was not the kind of thing you said in a performance review. He had a knack, apparently. 6 weeks after the press release, Kwesi received a phone call from a woman named Delia Hargreaves, who was a partner at a forensic accounting firm in Waterloo. She had, she said, been following the Meridian case closely. She had obtained a copy of Kwesi's original submission through the OSC's disclosure process. She had read it. She said, "I want to ask you something, and I'd like you to answer honestly." He said he would try. She said, "The bridge transaction analysis on pages 11 through 14. The recursive offset model. Did you develop that methodology yourself?" He said he did. There was a pause. She said, "I've been doing forensic accounting for 22 years. I've never seen that approach before. It's not in any of the standard frameworks. Where did it come from?" He thought about it for a moment. He said, "I couldn't find a framework that fit the pattern, so I built one." Another pause, longer this time. She said, "I'd like to meet." They met at a Tim Hortons in Waterloo because Kwesi to conference the following day in Kitchener, and the drive was manageable. Delia Hargreaves was 55, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses that she took on and off constantly while they talked. She had brought a printed copy of his submission with annotations in 4 different colored pens. She had questions. Very specific questions. The kind of questions that told Kwesi she had not only read his work, but had tried to verify his methodology independently, and found, at several points, that she couldn't quite get there without asking him directly. He answered the questions. At some point about 90 minutes in, she took her glasses off and set them on the table and said, "I have to be honest with you. When I first saw this come through the OSC disclosure, I assumed there would be a team. A small firm, maybe. Someone with institutional backing," he said. "No, just me," she said. "At your kitchen table," he said. "Yes," she said, "for 9 months." He said, 9.5. She put her glasses back on. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "My firm has a practice gap we've been trying to fill for 2 years. Complex derivative misrepresentation. The problem is that the people who understand the mathematics well enough to do the work don't have the accounting credentials, and the people with the accounting credentials can't do the mathematics. It's an either-or problem." Kwesi waited. She said, "I think you might be the first person I've met who's both. The question is whether you want to do this work professionally." He said, "What would that involve?" She said, "We'd sponsor your accreditation. It would take about 8 months. You have most of the foundation already. It's just the formal credentialing. During that period, we'd bring you on as a senior analytical consultant, non-credentialed but supervised, which is clean under our licensing structure. After accreditation, full partnership track." He said, "Partnership." She said, "You found what 3 professional teams missed. That's not a credential problem. That's a capability problem. We don't have your capability. I'd like to have it." The accreditation process took 9 months, not 8. The licensing examinations were, Kwesi said later, considerably easier than reconstructing a 30-year fraud scheme at a kitchen table. He passed all 3 on the first attempt. His supervisor at the logistics company, Bruce, was genuinely sorry to see him go. He gave Kwesi a card signed by the team and a gift certificate to a restaurant in Etobicoke that turned out, when Kwesi tried to use it, to have closed. It was the thought that counted. He kept the card. On the morning of Kwesi Darko's first day, as a fully credentialed partner at Hargreaves Vance Forensic, he took the GO train from Etobicoke to Waterloo. It was October. The leaves along the rail corridor were doing the things October leaves do in southern Ontario, which is to say they were extraordinary and somewhat aggressive about it, the way Ontario autumns tend to be, as though they know winter is coming and have decided to make a point. He sat in the quiet car with a coffee and a folder of preliminary materials for a new file. A municipal infrastructure case, complicated, the kind of thing that would take months to untangle. He thought about the note he had written to himself in the margin of page 7. "You are right. Keep going." He had not needed anyone to tell him he was right. He had been quite sure. The mathematics did not particularly care whether the room believed in it. But there had been nights. The ones around 2 in the morning when his daughter was asleep, and the sleet was on the window, and the pattern on his kitchen table was enormous, and he was very alone with it, when it had helped to write it down. "You are right. Keep going." He had kept going. The train moved through the October corridor, leaves flashing orange and gold in the gray morning light, and Kwesi Darko opened the folder and began to read. "There is something particular about the way this country treats a man who knows more than the room expects him to know. It is not always malice. Sometimes it is simple failure of imagination, the inability to look at a gray parka and a cardboard folder, and a man who walked 40 minutes in the sleet and think, this is where the answer is." The $200 registration fee that had kept generations of young Ghanaian Canadian professionals out of the credentialing process was reviewed by the relevant licensing body 2 years after the Meridian case closed. It was not eliminated, but a subsidized pathway was introduced, a sliding scale structure that Kwesi had quietly advocated for in 3 separate written submissions to the body, none of which were acknowledged. The pathway was introduced anyway. Sometimes the right answer wins even when no one will say who found it. What would have happened to those pension funds, the teachers, the nurses, the transit workers, if Kwesi Darko had decided, on one of those 2 in the morning nights, that the room's opinion of him was more reliable than his own? What is the cost of a room that cannot see past a gray parka? What gets lost? What gets stolen? Not by fraudsters, but by the simpler, quieter theft of a system that tells a man his work isn't work because his credential isn't credential. Those are not rhetorical questions. They have answers. And the answers are not abstract. Somewhere in Etobicoke, there is a kitchen table. It is an ordinary table, laminate, a scratch along one edge from when his daughter's was small. On that table, for 9.5 months, something was built that the best resourced professional teams in the province could not build. The table has no plaque on it. It never will. But the numbers are in the record, and the numbers don't lie.